In the Arabic tradition, the jinn kings can be born, they can have sons, and they can die and can be killed. And this is huge when it comes to studying the textual traditions.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to the Glitch Bottle Podcast, where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Eth, and today we welcome independent magical scholar and traditional bookbinder, Mihai Vârtejaru. Now, Mihai was born in Bucharest, Romania, and he still resides there. He attended the National University of Fine Arts, majoring in art pedagogy for teaching, and in the past, Mihai also taught art and architecture-related subjects. Many listeners are familiar with Mihai's independent magical research blog, known as Studies on Magic, where he delves into esoteric and magical manuscripts and connects the dots that either haven't been connected before, or he also explores them in more depth. He also translates and shares Solomonic-themed texts that really opened my eyes in terms of many of the well-known manuscripts. So, for example, in the Heptameron, there are the 7 aerial kings that are very well-known, and one of Mihai's posts is about the sigils of the 7 kings in a manuscript which I'd never seen before and really was great and practical information. In this episode, Mihai shares tips on how to properly research and compare magical manuscripts. He shares about his research into the Book of Bileth, which I think you'll really enjoy. He also talks about Romanian folk magic and many other subjects. Also, if you're a Glitch Bottle Patreon supporter, which to my patrons, thank you so much. I'm so honored for your support. You can hear bonus material where Mihai shares tips on getting into esoteric research for Solomonic practitioners and so much more. This was a great chat, and I hope you enjoy hearing from Mihai and learning as much as I did. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Mihai Vârtejaru. Mihai, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle Podcast today.
Hi, Alex. Glad to be here, and thank you for having me on the podcast. It's such a huge honor. You've had a host of wonderful guests as of lately. In fact, always. People I always admire and read. It's a great honor for me. Thank you.
Just a short confession for the listeners out there. Whenever I see you post a new article on some Solomonic or esoteric manuscript that you unearthed or that you translated, I say to myself, okay, let me just pause whatever I'm doing and read this, because it likely contains some new insights that can augment or amplify my current Solomonic ritual matrix knowledge. So that's totally your fault. In a good way.
Well, thank you very much, because the same feeling you have maybe when I post, I have the same feeling when I am about to do a post or when I'm about to finish an article, because every article is like a whole process. I don't just rant away for 20 minutes and then hit send and publish and the article is done. I usually find the manuscript and extract the images and pass them through Photoshop and upgrade them, then translate the Latin and translate the Latin into English, and then arrange it all very neatly in the blog matrix and then hit send. So yeah, it's pretty exciting for me too, because I don't know what the reach of the post would be. Maybe I get 20 readers for something I worked on for about 2 months, or maybe I get 1,000 readers in the first hour. It's crazy. It's actually a kind of a roller coaster.
Mihai, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because so many people are familiar with your blog, and you have this incredibly in-depth ability to publish and uncover manuscripts. For anyone who's seen the movie The Ninth Gate, you're pretty much like Johnny Depp's character. You look like Johnny Depp's character, Dean Corso, who is also constantly on some kind of esoteric quest with ancient books. So effectively, you're a badass who writes a really informative blog. Like, how did you, Mihai, first get interested in the esoteric studies, studying old manuscripts? Where did this come from for you?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the comparison, because The Ninth Gate, Roman Polanski, is one of my favorite movies, and Club Dumas by Arturo Pérez Reverte was based upon as one of my favorite books. But there's a huge difference between me and the character Dean Corso, or rather, I don't know what his name is in the book, but it's not Dean, because he's getting paid, actually, a lot of money. He's getting paid a lot of money by Boris Balkan or Boris Varga or something like this in the book. He's just looking around for one book throughout Europe, and I don't do that. I mean, I hunt books online or in bookshops or in libraries, but no eccentric millionaire pays me to do so. In fact, I am myself the eccentric millionaire that drives the studies, and the guy who does the research, and the Sanisa brothers who binds the books, of course, and the loony guy with a motorcycle, maybe, yeah. To answer your question, my interest in magic, per se, not necessarily in all things esoteric and occult, began at about the age 12. I had some very, very low quality and bad books about gypsy magic and stuff like that, but the lucky thing was that they were so mishmashed and mangled up that they actually contained pieces of manuscripts and old books from old magic books and magic manuscripts, which the author tried to pass off as gypsy carpets. I mean, the idea was preposterous because it was clearly a manuscript illumination with Latin phrases and signs of the fixed stars, and you can clearly see it was a handwritten document, and the author said, "Oh, this is a gypsy rug from the 19th century," and it was preposterous. And I kind of made it my duty to study them and see where they come from and see what the symbols are. It's so fascinating because when I first saw them, I thought they were so mysterious and arcane and incomprehensible that I had no chance in this life to learn their mysteries and their secrets. And lo and behold, just a few tens of years later, I kind of know them by heart.
Growing up in Romania, Mihai, can you inform our listeners who are not in Romania about the culture? I mean, was delving into the esoteric, was it deeply frowned upon? Was it kind of accepted? Was it just somewhere in between? Like, what was it like if you were a young person in Romania, and even to this day, and you want to explore esoteric subjects and things like that? Is there any resistance or pushback overall, or not really?
That's a hard subject to tackle. I mean, first of all, there were no materials whatsoever when I was growing up. I didn't have internet access until I was about, I don't know, maybe 18 or 19. I mean, real internet access, not just internet on my tablet or internet on my home computer. I mean, I had to go to internet cafes and download texts and copy and paste them into documents and save them for later, and I would print them and study them. I mean, that was the big push of my studies. But before that, I had to base my studies on several very dodgy and very shady books by Romanian authors. Maybe one or two were more interesting or more serious about the subject, and they always revolved around Masonry. So they were esoterically inclined Freemasons that read magical texts, and some of them actually translated parts of the Key of Solomon and Heptameron, but the books were so mixed up and mangled and badly translated, they could not be considered, I don't know, reliable in any sense of the word. So when it comes to information and when it comes to reliability, the big jump conceptually came when I had internet access and when I could read the texts for myself. And this is where my greatest inspiration comes in, Joseph Peterson, because he's the one that practically blew my mind with the amount of knowledge and information that he shared freely. Also, I saw many books and many brochures and a lot of websites that had pieces and bits stolen from his esoteric archives, and that kind of made me mad because many of them didn't give credit to him, and he still is one of my greatest examples to follow because I try to do a little bit what he did. He came in a market dominated by books and leaflets and pamphlets and badly translated pieces of work, and he just published online freely a great amount of knowledge and wisdom, and I try to do the same.
To that point, Mihai, was there one text, when you were younger, was there one specific book of Joe Peterson's that he's kind of edited or compiled or translated that really kind of ignited your inner esoteric fires? Was it one thing, or was it kind of a menagerie of different texts?
Well, that's the drawback of having no sources and no texts and no reliable translations, and then suddenly having them all. Back when I was studying without access to the internet and to esoteric archives, I used to pick up and collect all sorts of articles and pieces from books by different researchers. Maybe one published a talisman or an amulet, and one published a piece of a rite, or one something similar to that, a diagram that came from the ritualistic tradition. But when I came into contact with the esoteric archives, I had them all. So that was a bit overwhelming, and I had nowhere to grasp and nowhere to solidify all this knowledge, and I had to study it little by little, bit by bit, and learn how certain texts were older than some, and certain texts were younger, and certain texts were composites, and certain texts were originals, and little by little my idea of the Solomonic magic textual tradition began to crystallize. But it was a very slow process because I was hugely interested in everything. I mean, comparing divine names and comparing angelic names and demonic names and collating different amulets and different diagrams maybe, and comparing the way they shifted through time, and maybe trying to figure out what they were at the beginning, which is likely a dead end at some point. But I was very much drawn back by this, and of course, I didn't have any scientific method because I was very much self-taught, and nobody told me how to approach a text from the 16th century, and nobody told me how such a text might be structured and what family of texts it might be from. And I kind of had to deduce that by myself.
What was the first real in-depth deep dive that you took into an actual esoteric or a magical text? Maybe
the oldest text I could find of the Key of Solomon, also published by Joseph Peterson, was the Key of Solomon by Ptolemy the King. I don't remember the name of the Sloan manuscript because, by the way, everybody assumes I know all the manuscript and they just ask me for the reference number. I mean, what do you think about Sloan 3258? I'm supposed to say, oh, that's a great manuscript. What about Sloan 6428-70? Oh, that's a great one too. I love that. I don't remember everything or all the manuscripts because only the Sloan family is huge. I remember some because they're very easy to remember, but otherwise no. So this was the King Solomon by Ptolemy the King, disciple, a so-called disciple of Solomon, who was also known in history by the name of Tosgrek, which was a very mysterious character. And of course, the translation of the Key of Solomon is somewhere from about the 15th century, the oldest English translation of the Key of Solomon we have. And I believe I delved into that because it was the oldest text that was floating around of the said work. And it was simply fascinating. I mean, I started comparing the conjurations, and I started looking up names and looking up what Mathers did with his book and why he chose to put in some things and take out others. And it's still one of my favorite works and one of my favorite manuscripts, although I cannot remember the number.
Do you do this in a specific place? Like, did you have to travel to specific libraries? Was this eventually more digital? Can you just kind of, like, would you be sitting in a dark medieval chamber somewhere with beeswax candles burning on either side of you as you turn the pages and try not to get caught by the authorities? I mean, can you tell us about kind of what you did?
Yeah, no, of course. My candlelit torture dungeon is strictly for that and not for reading. It's very perilous for pages, and I try not to. But in the beginning, I was advised by certain teachers that I could go to different universities and ask for internet access there at the library. But I soon found that it was very complicated. I was about, 16, 17. I had to go to universities and say, "Hi, can I use your computer?" And they asked why. And I responded, "Well, I want to get knowledge." "Okay, are you a student?" I said, "No, I have a few years until I can become a student at this university." And they said, "Okay, do you want to go to this university?" I said, "No, you're the only university that has internet access." And they said, "Okay, well, yeah, we'll think about it, and maybe you can fill out a form and then drop it in the mail in about 2 days, and you will get a response, and then maybe we can stamp your form and eventually call you." And it was just an endless row of excuses of not letting a 16-year-old use your internet terminal. So I had to turn to internet cafes. When other people, let's say, or kids were playing computer games, I was just taking notes and saving texts on my diskettes. I had a huge collection of those and some kind of notebook I used to draw diagrams and seals on. And I think the others might have feared me because I was kind of an oddball, drawing demonic circles and seals and stuff like this, and they were playing Call of Duty, and I don't know what the hell that was. After I finally had internet access at my place, at my home, I began just printing them and printing them and printing them, and then just studying them back at my place. I had the great opportunity to live by myself in my own little studio from about the age of 14, and that was very lucky for me. And I had all the privacy needed to study such texts. My family had nothing against it. My mother was kind of an atheist or an agnostic. My brother also. My father was not in the picture, and I didn't have any other siblings. But yeah, my home was very magically, studily, friendly environment, to say the least.
When you were evolving and developing this interest in esoteric research, like, did you have any contact with spiritual entities, or did you have any, I guess for lack of a better phrase, paranormal experiences that might have even subconsciously nudged you towards esoteric research, or anything that you can share on that?
Well, that's a complicated question because I'm mainly very, very scientific in my approach. I did not base my interest and fascination in subjective experiences of any kind. However, what drove me to study more and learn more and compare more was the similarity of the stories told within my family, or the stories told in the rural area of my country, with the things described in the Solomonic text. I actually wrote a small piece of prose about one such thing. I was not, of course, the witness to this, but I was just the receiver of the story, in which some woman from a village who was known by my grandmother, who passed away quite some years ago. She was known as a witch, and she used to go to a pond outside the village, and she used to conjure the devil. I was very, very small back then. I was very little. I was about 6 or 7 years old. And she used to tell me that she had this rod, this hazel, or I don't know what kind of a tree rod. and she used to hit the water with the rod and conjure up the devil in the power of the night. And I asked my grandmother, and did the devil came? And she said, oh, yes, he came. But she wanted the guy next to that, hierarchically, the bigger guy. And she said, no, bring me the one that you serve. And she used to hit the water again, and the guy submerged, and he brought the other demon who was higher up. And then she was still dissatisfied and hit the water again and asked the demon to fetch the higher ranking demon above him. And he submerged, and the third time, the third demon, who was more powerful than the first two, came. This is hugely interesting because it shares a lot of traits with a lot of Solomonic texts and Faustian texts. This was something that people in those times saw as very natural and extremely useful in doing, because nobody used to conjure up the devil because they wanted knowledge in the villages. They conjure up the devil because they wanted to marry someone, or they wanted their son to come alive from the war, or because they wanted to enlarge their fortune. I mean, there is no romanced idea of the summoning of the devil or of the practice of magic. It's just basic, hardcore magic taught and practiced by not very literate individuals. So they had no textual resources other than, the spells or rituals that were taught to them by other witches or other practitioners. It seems that these rites or these conjurations really did occur, and I've had many other examples of stories of such conjurations taking place, and none of them were literate. None of them had access to books or the internet, maybe 80 years ago or 70 years ago. So that's really fascinating.
Looking back now, with your experience and knowledge of esoteric texts, and especially with this recent discussion online with, this whole thing about village magic, quote unquote, or cunning man's magic, quote unquote, and a cunning man's grimoire. And like you mentioned, Joseph Peterson publishing Secrets of Solomon, which is kind of a bridge, quote unquote, between high learned magic and village magic. Looking back on all that, do you see the fingerprints of those kind of relationships? Because it seems like you're describing in Romania, at least you personally experiencing this kind of, village magic or cunning man, cunning woman magic.
It's very difficult to explain because not a great deal has been written about Romanian folk magic. I mean, it has been written, but it's primarily from a scientific point of view, like doctors or priests going to the countryside and taking chants or incantations from people and writing them down and publishing them, which are very common. But complex rituals, like the one I mentioned before, are virtually non-existent, mainly because people were and still are very distant and very suspicious of anyone who tries to learn magic, especially if they're part of the church or if they're an important figure in the village, and are very keen to keep the secrets. Secrecy is a great, great part of traditional village magic. I remember my own grandmother had this little chant or incantation, which, again, they're very, very common in village magic. She in her opinion, used to cure the evil eye. I remember her chanting it, and I learned it from her. And it's fascinating because she never used to say it to me out loud, and she never used to just mumble it without me being able to hear it. But every time when she uttered the incantation, she used to say it just loud enough for me to make out the words, and just low enough so it wasn't considered that she gave away the chant. And this is very, very widely known as a method of teaching such methods and incantations. I mean, from the ancient Babylonian texts down to my grandmother, the whispering or the correct and articulate mumbling of a sacred chant to someone who is supposed to learn it or steal it rather is a very powerful tool in teaching. it's very fascinating for me, of course, and I've studied the phenomenon. Even today, the gypsy witches that make a great deal of money in Romania have the same method of teaching forward the craft of witchcraft. I mean, just mumbling the stuff that they do to their apprentices or their daughters, nieces, or whatever you want, so they could learn it, but it would not be considered to be given away or given away freely. Otherwise, the magic maybe loses the effect. Something very similar to this we can find in learned magic, in the Sworn Book of Honorius, if you recall, because Honorius writes this book of magic, and it has to be buried with it, and only the close disciples get to make one written hand copy of it and swear by it, and then as well they can just be buried with it or pass it along. But it's very sacred, and nothing is taught outside of this covenant between the magician and the apprentice.
That just seems like such an organic way to pass along information, but totally unexpected. Like, it's so much the opposite of, sitting in a university class and studying for 3 years,
Yes, exactly. Because once you have an effort to learn something, to remember something, to have it stored, whether it is in your memory or in your notebook, you prize that information much more. Whether you have the direct access to a text or book or something like this, it's just not the same. Usually I see all kinds of people, because I get asked about maybe weekly to teach people magic. Teach me magic. I want to learn magic. I want to do magic. Although my blog is specifically not about teaching magic or practicing magic or summoning demons or cursing your neighbors or something like this. I usually tell people why I cannot do that, because I'm primarily a scientist and a researcher, and they just won't understand that, and they do not make the distinction between a scientist or a researcher and a magician. So they think that if I published about magic, I have to do magic. If I published an article about the 7 Jinn kings of the Darmstadt manuscript, I've already conjured them up and I've talked to them, and that's why I published it. No, it's just that I found this information, I translated it, and then I published it. It doesn't mean I already did the whole ritual thing and the contact with the entities I'm writing about. It's the same. Actually, it's a very funny similarity, because as I bind books for a living, everybody assumes that I've read all the books that I've bound, and that's just insane. I can't remember the titles of the books that I bound, let alone reading them. It's absolutely insane. So I did not do everything that I write about in my magical blog, and I haven't done all the rituals in my magical blog, and I haven't summoned all the angels and all the demons in my scientific articles, much the same way regular people did not have relations with every girl or every woman they known throughout their lives, and did not eat everything they see daily. That would be quite insane. So I try to take more of a moderate approach to my study. When people have such requests, I tend to send them to my reading list and tend to explain what the difference between textual study and practice is. That seems to be fairly efficient.
Mihai, to that very point about you taking that more academic approach, that kind of rigorous approach, can we kind of delve into some of the different manuscripts? I know one of the manuscripts that you reference a lot in your blog and in the different posts you make is the Ghent manuscript. Can you just, for the listeners again who are not too familiar, what is the Ghent manuscript? What time frame are we talking about, and why is the Ghent manuscript so significant?
Yes, the Ghent manuscript is, as I said, one of the manuscripts that people assume I know by heart, and that people assume I know everything about it. It just isn't. It's one of the manuscripts I've found and I had to work on and I was fascinated by. And it's just a treasure trove of astral image magic and ceremonial magic that is really, really hard to come by in other manuscripts. I believe it was found walled up or plastered up in a wall in a mental institution in Ghent, and then taken and restored and so forth by scientists, by book restorers who did a great job. It was very broken up and very destroyed, and sadly a lot of text had to suffer from this damage, but the restorers actually did quite a good job of putting the pages back together. But again, sadly, a lot of the text is destroyed. Some images are destroyed either by fire or by, water damage. So a lot of the treatises of image magic and ceremonial magic from the Leipzig manuscript collection, which is one of my favorite collections of magical manuscripts, actually have older versions in the Ghent manuscript. It was made available online by the library that holds it. It was just a huge step for me to be able to study such a text, and the images also are almost unique in the manuscript tradition, and it holds some images and some version of treatises that I hadn't had access to. So it's hugely important, especially the works of Belenus, or so to say Apollonius of Tyana, who is actually maybe a pseudo-figure in the talismanic tradition. It's assumed that he was in fact an Arab scholar or an Arab mathematician and scientist and occultist writing in the 8th or 9th century. The importance of the treatises in the Ghent manuscript are so great, because we still have references and images that are very similar to it. If we look in the Folger manuscript that was translated by Dan Harms and Joseph Peterson, the same images, the same talismans are transmitted with maybe little to no modification for maybe 200 years. And we have no idea how many manuscripts it used as a source, but it's so deeply fascinating because you can study the older versions and compare it to the newer versions and see what inversions and what modifications there are to it. We have the name of the guy that copied it, Cornelius Brentius. It's on paper. It's not very impressive if you looked at it before it was restored. I mean, it was just a bunch of loosely tied up rags, papers. It did not resemble the vellum manuscripts from the Vatican that are lavish manuscripts, lavishly decorated and neatly written. The hand that it employs is very hard to read. It's very cursive, and the ink is likely to become faded away, and it's very hard to decipher. That's one of the main reasons that I didn't tackle it. But if someone with enough knowledge of Latin or Dutch or German decides to take it on, I think it would do us a lot of good, because the importance of the Ghent manuscript is just huge.
And to your point, Mihai, one of the areas, and you document this on your blog, where the Ghent manuscript and the Leipzig manuscripts kind of cross paths, or at least have similar material, is a blog post that you did on the seals of the 7 kings of the air. And I found this post, like many of yours, really fascinating because so many listeners I know are familiar with the Heptameron and the aerial kings of the day. Each day of the week, there are kings that are very, well known. Maimon probably among them on Saturday, for example. And underneath them are certain aerial spirits and angels of the directions, etc. But you did a blog post about the seals of the 7 kings of the air, talking about how the Ghent manuscript has one figure that contains them, and that's similar to another figure, somewhat incomplete, from one of the Leipzig manuscripts. Can you just kind of share with the listeners, Mihai, a little bit about how you came across this specific connection between the two manuscripts, and really the significance for people who are familiar with the Heptameron and the Sworn Book of Honorius? Why is it so significant about these seals of the 7 kings of the air?
Well, to start off, the aerial kings of the Heptameron have had very little information put out about them. And mainly everybody who researched or worked with the Heptameron prior to our age of huge grimoire evolution in the maybe 20 years, the last 20 years. Little was known about them and little was published about them. I mean, they were just names. If you looked up Maimon or Varakan, it just said king of the air of the day of Saturday or the day of Monday. So nothing was known about them. They were just names. No one knew what they were, who they were, where they came from, what was their significance or scope or role. This changed once we had more and more texts. It became more and more apparent that they were spirits of the air, taken from Arabic lore and Arabic magic, who ruled certain days, certain directions in the world, and came from one such direction in a certain day, or ruled the certain domain in the planetary sublunar world, and they were very earthly powers. I mean, they were subjected to the planetary rulership, but they were very earthly and down-to-earth powers that used to be commanded to obtain very worldly ends. In the Leipzig manuscript, we have a very nice design from Salomonis Trimosini Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of Solomon Trimosinus, who was a fable alchemist. We have a sort of mirror-like object or something akin to that, a device maybe used to see spirits or maybe used to divine things, because such mirrors, polished steel, were very widely used in the cataptormantic magic, the gazing of shiny surfaces. On the outer brim, we have not only the names of the spiritual kings of the spirits, but the planets as well, and their seals. The Heptameron lists only the seals of the archangels. The Heptameron, we have to understand that is a very complex treatise, but it's very condensed. So in other books, we have the seals of every angel that are listed there. The Heptameron does not list that. In some books, we have the seals of the archangels and maybe the seals of the kings of the spirits. In the Heptameron, we only have the seals of the archangels. And that's why I believe it's a very condensed system meant to be operative and not explanatory, because the explanatory treatises, the huge lists of spirits and seals and passwords and angelic orders and catalogs of spirits, such as the Ars Teurgia Solomonis, which contains a huge number of seals, they are explanatory. And the Heptameron is rather operative because it lists the precise manner of operating, and it just assumes that the student or the practitioner has the knowledge of the seals already. And maybe he has mastered the spirits and has the seals, has the offices in a separate book, so it doesn't have to reference them again in itself. I believe the Salomonis Trimosini Kabbalah is inspired by one such explanatory treatise, and the Ghent manuscript also is such a document. I think they're linked because the names are almost the same, the seals are the same, and the planetary attribution is the same. But again, it's not an explanatory text. It's about an experiment done to see or to contact these spirits by the use of this diagram or by the use of a mirror. Like the Heptameron, it's very condensed, so it doesn't say this is the king and this what you should do and this is his name and this is his office and these are his subjects, but it just gives us a diagram of all the seals and all the names and probably tells us what to do with it, but it's not explanatory in the sense that it lists everything. So even this is a shortened and practical text, just like the Heptameron, and we have a lot of these. Coincidentally, we just have the missing link that we do not have in the Heptameron. We have the seals and the planetary attribution and the names, which is hugely fascinating to come across a text which has the missing link from another text and is still very practically oriented and not explanatory. It's huge. It's fascinating.
There's also this kind of use of Mercury and Wednesday being associated with Barkan or Varkan Rex, if one were to use the Heptameron, which switches, of course, Mercury and Sunday. You know, Wednesday and Sunday is switched, and Michael and Raphael are usually switched. In your experience, I think some listeners are familiar with that. You know, if you compare the Heptameron and the Sworn Book, there's specific angels that might be switched, you know, like Sundays and Wednesdays are usually switched. And that's the case here in terms of, you know, the planet and the aerial king. But then in the Heptameron, it's on Sunday. Like, where does that whole thing come from in terms of switching Wednesday and Sunday and the close association between Michael and Raphael? Is there anything that you can share that might help illuminate that?
I believe that there are two complete different traditions that came from that. The main thing that separated everything was the publication of the magical calendar, where the switch took place. But I'd like to point out that the 7 aerial kings are even more mangled in the Ghent manuscript and the Leipzig, because, for example, the king of the moon is called Maimon, which in the Heptameron is the king of Saturday. We have this idea that everything is very fixed, and all the spirit names were just the same 100 years ago and 500 years ago and 2,000 years ago, that Michael was the archangel of the sun, and Raphael was the archangel of Mercury, and that Zadkiel was the archangel of Jupiter. It is not. So if you could pick up any book of, I don't know, pre-medieval magic and just study the planetary attributions of the 7 archangels or the variations of names, you would be so astounded to find that these names change and mix and suffer changes all the time from age to age, and we have no idea why. We have no idea if in the mind of the magicians that work them, the angels take shifts in, I don't know, in serving a certain planetary force, or if they are mistakes in texts that are perpetuated because the switch with Raphael and Michael are very much textual errors, or not, I don't know, mystically explained. It's just that somebody wrote Michael on the seal of Raphael and Raphael on the seal of Michael and just got perpetuated like this. But yes, we have this idea that everything was fixed and everything is one way and one way is correct. And if there are another way, it's wrong. And many, many times when I publish seals, like from the Heptameron, and the attributions are switched, I have a lot of comments. That seal is wrong. You had it wrong. That's not right. Many times these are people that learned about seals or grimoires from modern sources like the Golden Dawn tradition or Agrippa. They think that's correct. Their version, the first version they learn, is the correct way. And if they see anything that is different to this, that is the incorrect version. And it's not incorrect at all. It's just different. If you would read, I think Gideon Bohak wrote something about Jewish magic, and Yuval Harari wrote about the Jewish magic before the rise of the Kabbalah, and Raphael Patai also. Patai, I believe, lists the names of the archangels linked to the planets and certain Jewish rites and prayers and magical manuscripts. And if you look under all the 7 planets, for example, Michael and Gabriel just jump all over the place. So ideally, if we are to take a Kabbalistic explanation, Gabriel would be the angel of Gevurah, the angel of Mars, because his name means my God is my strength. This was very complicated to explain to modern Kabbalists or modern magical practitioners, because if every angel is derived, if every Sephira has an angel derived from its name, like from Malkut, Malkutiel, from Keter, Keteriel, the angel derived from Gevurah, the Sephira of Mars, would be Gabriel. And that's very confusing because everybody knows Gabriel is linked to the moon. Actually, Gabriel is linked to the moon only recently, in the last 500 or 600 years. He used to be associated with Saturn and with Mars and with Venus, which is very new to a lot of people, but that doesn't make it wrong or incorrect. He was just associated with a different planetary domain or area in a different period of time. If we have in the Ghent manuscript King Maimon, who belongs to the moon, and in the Heptameron King Maimon, who belongs to Saturn, it's not wrong. It's not that the Heptameron is right and the Ghent manuscript is wrong, or the Ghent manuscript is right and the Heptameron is wrong. It's just that they operate in different views and in different schools of thought. When people operated in those schools of thought, that version was the correct one, and that's why they employed it.
Another part of your job in your blog is to answer comments and things like that. And I just have to read this because this is from your 7 Kings of the Air post, where someone, an unknown person, said to you after reading your post about the 7 Kings of the Air, quote, "These seals strongly resemble the figures depicted around the secret seal of Solomon in the Lemegeton. On the secret seal, clockwise from top, it's Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Sun, Mars. The shapes are corrupt, but I think the connection is obvious." And then another comment, that's an anonymous comment, says, "Compare this to the secret seal of Solomon from top clockwise, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Sun, and Mars." And then you replied to both of those saying, quote, "I am sorry, but there is no connection whatsoever. The resemblance must be exact, not kinda. This sort of reasoning has numerous drawbacks, I'm afraid. Also, there's no reason why the seals of the 7 Jinn kings would keep the 72 demons in the vessel. It is counterintuitive when reported to the hierarchy of spirits. Furthermore, the order you suggest is neither the Chaldaic order or the weekly order of the 7 planets. But thank you for following my blog and for the comment. Have a great day." I just love how you end that. Like, how often, Mihai, do you come across engagement from readers, but how often do you find yourself having to gently or not so gently kind of nudge certain readers or certain people who are commenting in a different direction? Like, how often does that happen?
Well, it very much depends on my post's output, because when I post more, I tend to have these comments every day. And when I post less frequently, like now, I usually have these comments, I don't know, about weekly or bi-weekly. I know there's a great attraction to study these things and to draw conclusions on your own, but a lot of people just draw conclusions without studying very, very well. So I recently had to explain to a gentleman that, quote, "the seals in the magical books are not very similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs and Chinese ideograms, because other than the fact that they're both written or drawn, there is no similarity between them. They're completely different systems of communication, and they look differently, and they act differently, and they serve different purposes. The fact that they're not writing, as you know, writing, is not a reason why they should be similar or very similar. Because if you look at Chinese ideograms, and if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you look at magical characters in Solomonic or image magic, you can see they're mysterious, but that's about it. Because if you don't know them, you have no idea what they say. Maybe the characters in books of magic are very similar to alchemical symbols and glyphs. That's very true, because most alchemical symbols were made up by the same people that used astrological glyphs or zodiacal glyphs or magical sigils. That's very true. They are very similar. Chinese letters are very similar to other Oriental systems of writing in the same area, of course, but are not very similar to Jewish or Arabic magical symbols. Egyptian hieroglyphs are very similar to other hieroglyphs in the same region, maybe Proto-Sumerian or Proto-Elamite script, but are by no chance similar to magical symbols or Chinese ideograms. I mean, you have to be very, very, I wouldn't want to say stupid, but you have to be very young and very ignorant of various writing systems to draw such a conclusion. So when you say that the seals of the 7 Jinn kings resemble the secret seal of Solomon, that tells us something about your capacity to discern writing symbols and, morphemes, shapes used to denote various ideas, and your culture. If you link something that I just published to something extremely well known, like the secret seal of Solomon, because there's a very limited amount of knowledge of literature when it comes to magical symbols, widely available if you're not a specialist. So you have the Key of Solomon, you have the 7 seals of the Arbatel and seals of the Goetia, and that's about it for a lot of people. So when they see something mysterious or they see a seal, oh, that's very similar to the seals of the Goetia. Oh, that's very similar to the angelic seals of the Arbatel. No, it's not. It's just something that you know and you have the capacity to compare. When you study this field for 20 years, because I think I'm nearing 15 or 17 years of study, you begin to make deeper connections. I mean, that's why I could equate the symbols I found in the Ghent manuscript to the symbols I found in the Leipzig manuscript. And I didn't start researching all over again, starting from the Greek magical papyri down to the Key of Solomon to see what seal they were akin to and what seal they were very similar to and what Goetic king had a similar symbol. No, you just have to narrow it down, because if you have a series of 7 entities or 7 kings, you already narrow it down, because it's impossible to equate them with the kings of the Goetia, because those are not planetary, and the kings of the regions of the world from the Vârtejaru, because they are cardinal and elemental and have nothing to do with the planetary powers. And you have to go further and see what spirits are linked to planetary powers in what treatises. And that way it's easier to find connections. If you start at just this symbol looks mysterious and therefore must be the same as the same mysterious symbol I saw in a book, it's just a dead end.
There is that element of showing fidelity to the scholarly methods and really showing fidelity to the history and having an open mind about things, but not becoming so Illuminati-esque or conspiratorial to say, aha, I found a squiggle here and there's a squiggle in this book and they must be the same thing. It's like, no, they're not.
Yes. It's a huge temptation to make all sorts of links and all sorts of connections, because people tend to think that magic and Hermeticism and alchemy were one big current of secret teaching that everybody knew and everybody had access to it and everybody knew this and knew that in all periods of time. And this is simply not accurate historically or scientifically, because many people had one delineation and one system and used to run with that, and other people had this system and this way of doing things and this paradigm. That's why you have, like we have today, yes, 2 diverging schools of Arabic learned magic, planetary magic, which has one set of Jinn kings attributed this way planetarily and one set of Jinn kings attributed this way planetarily. Both are passed on either through Spain or through Italy into Europe, and both are translated into Latin, and both make their way up the continent to the English and German-speaking countries, and they both end up in magical treatises, and they're very, very similar in their core, but have very wide dissimilarities, like the attribution of the Jinn kings to the days of the week. So the process is the same, the methods are the same, but the spirits are a bit different. So if there are such huge differences in the same school of thought, in the same school of practical magic and evocator magic or astral magic or talismanic magic, there are huger differences in all other aspects of this practice. And the idea that everybody knew everything and everybody had access to everything is just false. We are accustomed to think that because we have the internet. 500 years ago, nobody had access to this, and nobody had access to one book of magic, let alone a whole shelf of magical books. He could just peruse and see the seals and just do his little spells and put it back in the shelf. That's just utopian, to say the least.
500 years ago, you were lucky if you maybe one time caught a glimpse of a translated Key of Solomon and maybe were able to, get a copy or make a copy. And then that was what you had. That was it, whereas now it's almost like this oversaturation, which is a good thing because, like you say, we have so much information at our fingertips, but it can turn into something where there's just this constant academic comparing and arguing about this is right, no, this is right. But it seems like from what you said, the answer is that it's not that it's right or wrong. It's just that it's just different. It's different tributaries. It's different streams of history and esotericism, effectively.
Well, actually, if I may, I could make an augmentation to that view. Usually, you would have been very lucky to get a glimpse of one text. Usually, the usual person would have been very lucky to find or to grasp or to copy one magical book. That's usually. There have been, throughout history, a few unusual characters who basically attracted loads of tomes and books to them. One such person was King Alphonse of Spain, as you know, under whose command the Picatrix was written, and a lot of texts were translated from the Arabic, translated into Spanish, and then translated into Latin and made their way into Europe. He was hugely cognizant of magic and astrology and all sorts of mystical thingies. He was one such person who had access to a lot of knowledge. One other person would be Emperor Rudolf II, who gathered around him a lot of magicians and alchemists and astrologers. Also the Abbot Tritemius of Würzburg, who had the hugest collection of magical books and astrological books and necromantical books of his age, whose collection was used also by the young Agrippa to write his 3 books of occult philosophy. Those were the peaks of occult knowledge and magical knowledge of their times. They were very, very rare, but they did exist. Of course, there have been other, say, clerical figures and doctors and wealthy merchants who amassed huge amounts of manuscripts. And in these huge amounts of manuscripts, we can find 5 or 6 magical or astromagical books, which is huge for that time. That's very rare. The library that belonged to John Dee, this is one example. When we take a look historically at the importance of these characters, we tend to think that they were the most met with characters when we think about magic and the practice of magic and the practice of talismanical magic. But I don't think they were. I think that most of the work was done by separate individuals and was transmitted by separate individuals that didn't have the library of Tritemius and didn't have the library of King Alphonse and didn't have the library of King Rudolf II. They were just regular individuals who apprenticed with one master and passed on their knowledge and so forth and so forth.
Is there anything you can share with your understanding, Mihai, on the master-apprentice and really the history of that and just how it affected the transmission, as you said, of the esoteric texts?
Well, we don't know a lot textually about the relation of the master to the disciple or the disciple to the master, because it's usually not recorded. Very, very few manuscripts tell this, and very few sources relate the relation in which the major, the sorcerer, gives the information forward. Ideally, some treatises are viewed as letters or epistles of the magician to the apprentice. One of the most known such books is The Key of Solomon, who in many versions is written by King Solomon to his son Roboam. So it begins with "My dear son Roboam," and so forth and so forth. Other families of Solomonic texts tell stories of 4 disciples of Solomon, among which is this mysterious Tozgrek or Tothgrek or Hermes, in fact, who is one of the 4 disciples of Solomon, who has one of the 4 rings of the disciples of Solomon, and it's a whole mythology behind it. So it's a direct quote to the relationship of the disciples to the master. The Key of Solomon family of texts also has instructions for the disciples to be placed within the circle in certain points, and one has the sword and one has the book, and the master is free to do this and other things, and the disciples just help them. So we know that in many cases the practice of ritual magic was not a solitary endeavor, it was a group endeavor. But also we have instances of rites and operations that are meant to be done in solitude and without any assistance. If we look at the Hygromanteia, or the magical treatise of Solomon in its Greek translation, we have a lot of rituals in which the mage or the magician employs a young boy or a young girl in order to see in the mirror or in the crystal or in the water basin the shapes. So we have no idea if the little boy or the girl are seen just as tools or facilitators of the gazing part of the ritual, or are indeed disciples or followers in the magic of the said master or exorcist. In many cases, I believe they're just children employed for their purity, and they're not disciples. I believe one church writer gives an account of an old priest doing all sorts of rituals with young boys and young girls, and apparently they became visually impaired. I think it's John of Seville. John of Seville was the guy who was actually employed in his youth by an older priest to become a seer in his right, and he was not in fact a disciple in magic of the said exorcist. He was just used as a tool to see the shapes in the crystal or in the water basin. The appearance of the disciple in the text are pretty rare. There are some texts actually that tell stories and narratives, such as the magic of Brahman and the Mage, the story of Abraham who travels from Germany to Egypt to learn with the Brahman the key of the true magic and Kabbalah. But that can be viewed as initiatic document, much like the Sage of the Pyramids family of texts. There are some manuscripts of concise magical or necromantical practices that are not attributed to one magician in particular, but are clearly explained to someone, like the CLM 849 manuscript that was translated by Richard Kiekefer under the name of A Necromancer's Manual. Some rituals actually address someone in the second person, ideally some notable person of high stature, maybe a king or an emperor. You have seen me do this, or you have seen me perform this in your court, or you can do this and you can do that. The explanations are not general, but addressative. So they address a person and they're meant to explain something to them that has previously been experienced. So it's not a technical manual of something that should be done. It's a very practical manual based on the reminiscence of an effect. Now it's just explained. This is how you can do the thing you saw me do. And that's very important when it comes to proving the relation of master and disciple in the text. But other than this, there are very few instances where we have a clear transmission of knowledge. That's more recent. So we have some manuscripts that belong to Ebenezer Sibley, and they passed on to a whole host of ceremonial magicians that were angelic magicians from John Dee and Dr. Thomas Rudd, I believe Stephen Skinner and David Rankin have a better idea of the transmission points, down to Francis Barrett. And it's hugely interesting because some had fights and some had disagreements and some rejected some teachers, but there seemed to be quite a clear transmission of ceremonial angelical magical practice between these individuals. But older than these instances of angelic ceremonial British magicians, we have no such relations, sadly.
To that point, Mihai, there was just in February of 2019, you made a blog post on a fascinating text that I would love to kind of get into, which is the Book of Bileth. Originally in Hebrew, this is a short grimoire that was translated into English for the first time, and it's found in 4 manuscripts of the Key of Solomon, the Sefer Bileth, or the Book of Bileth. Can you share with our listeners, this is a fascinating text, and how did you come to find this text, and the 4 different versions, and how did you translate this? Who did you work with? Just how did this whole thing come about?
I would start by saying that I had no merit whatsoever in the translation. The only thing that I did was try to contact people who knew Hebrew and were magically inclined, could help me from the time that I learned about the text down to now. I had a lot of bad luck in finding such a translator. Where it all began was when I found the Golan's edition of the Sefer Maftech Shlomo on the Esoteric Archives website, reproduced by Joseph Peterson. And I had very little information at that time about it. In time, Dr. Stephen Skinner actually, we collaborated and we exchanged ideas and manuscripts and so forth. And upon finding that I didn't have a copy of the book, he actually sent me the Teton Press version of it, signed, the version that he helped publish, and it was such a huge impact on me that I found it so fascinating, and I tried to study it, but of course it was just cursive Hebrew, and nobody wanted to touch it because it's so hard and so difficult to translate. It just stood a lot of a great number of years on my shelf and on my study desk, and actually began to study the book by parts and actually try to learn the cursive Spanish Hebrew alphabet, used to write it with moderate success, because I could read it, but I had no idea what it said because, of course, it was in Hebrew. Then I began to work with Rabbi Yosef Michael Cohen, who is very good, who knows Hebrew like the back of his hand and knows English even better. And I asked him, after a course of about 3 possible translators, if he could do it. And in about 2 weeks, he came up with his translation, which was immense for me. From the time that I gave him the translation, other manuscripts came to light, including an Italian version. So the Italian version parallels the Hebrew version quite well. And I believe this is not, in fact, a Hebrew book of magic. The Sefer Maftech Shlomo is clearly written by someone in Italy, not necessarily Jewish. A lot of Christian elements still reside in the text. So it was copied by someone Jewish from non-Jewish texts, and primarily Latin or Italian books of magic that were written by Catholic people or priests. This particular version is part of, I believe, a course of 1 or 2 other books. One is about the Ring of Bileth, and another one is about the generation of Bileth, which is very, very interesting. We spoke about the identification of the 7 aerial kings as being jinn. This is one other aspect of the jinn magic and Arabic magic, the fact that every spirit has a genealogy. So in the Book of Bileth and also in the Book of Soiga, employed by John Dee, we have the genealogy of King Bileth. So we have Bileth, who is son of Aned, who is son of Shamron, who is son, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And there are few demons listed. And apparently he is a descendant of King Ashmodai from the time of Solomon. Of course, we can study the genealogy of Bileth in the manuscripts and see the resemblances, the differences, and actually the lack of chronological logic or plausibility, because Bileth is seen as a demon who is son of a demon, 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 who is son of Ashmodai, who helped Solomon build the temple. So in the Lammageddon, let's say, Ashmodai and Bileth are actually alive at the same time in the time of Solomon. Even more so, the Book of Spirits employed by Johann Weyer lists Bileth as one of the demons present in the time of Noah, and that his son, Kam, or the tutelary ancestor of Egyptians, actually employed King Bileth and wrote a book on demon summoning with Bileth as a source, which is very interesting if he would have been a descendant of King Ashmodai, who was alive at the time of King Solomon. So there are a lot of logical inaccuracies, and this is just part of the beauty of the mythos around demon hierarchies and demon genealogies. But this part of the genealogy of a demon got very lost along the way, and usually modern readers just assume that the demons described in, let's say, in the Lammageddon are ancient, ageless, and deathless, and bornless entities that have always existed and have been created by God and are immortal. No, this is very wrong. In the Arabic tradition, the jinn kings can be born, they can have sons, and they can die and can be killed. And this is huge when it comes to studying the textual traditions. We have the Book of Soiga, which is very similar to the Liber Bileth translated by Jean-Baptiste Boudet. He actually translated a Latin version, a Venetian manuscript of the Liber Bileth, which is very different from the Liber Bileth that I've managed to translate, because his version is very practical, lists the genealogy of Bileth and lists all the exorcisms and the rituals and the manufacturing of the knife used to summon him, but lacks any mention of hordes of demons or subject entities or spirits that are under him. What we have in the manuscript that I managed to translate is the exact opposite. We have no idea of the ritual employed, but we have the description of the demons that are in the service of King Bileth and their seals. Actually, every demon or every group has two different set of seals. I have no idea why. We don't have the texts that go before this, and we don't have the texts of the Ring of Solomon translated, of the Ring of Bileth translated, and we don't have the exhortation translated. But something that will prove more efficient, the same text is very closely paralleled in the Italian version of the manuscript. I believe I'll manage to translate that first. That's something very useful, to have a parallel text in Italian, which is more likely to have been copied from the source of the Hebrew manuscript itself and not retranslated from Hebrew, which was in turn translated from the Italian or Latin.
The collaboration, I mean, just like you were saying, you mentioned this in your blog post as well, and I really encourage listeners to check it out. But, you know, as you mentioned, working with Rabbi Yosef Michael Cohen, Daniel Clark, Jean-Patrice Boudet, Dr. Stephen Skinner, you mentioned Dan Schneider. I mean, there's so many people. When you are researching a manuscript like this or similar manuscripts, can you talk a little bit about the spirit of collaboration? Is that a typical thing for scholars who may be individually pursuing different manuscripts to kind of get together and share information, or how does that usually work?
It's a very interesting subject because I believe we are on different tiers or levels of communication. So I have access to people such as Dr. Stephen Skinner and Joseph Peterson, Dan Schneider, Carl Sofer, who work on this text and operate with them. But I have very limited access to more academically inclined people such as Jean-Patrice Boudet or Claire Fanger or Richard Kiekhaefer, who are mainly, as I said, academically inclined and are less talkative about these subjects, because we have to understand that if magic and texts on magic are a big part of the interests of Dr. Skinner or Joseph Peterson, they're much less so with other academia professors or researchers. So they're not at the same level of interest. Even more so, I don't think that I have anything to offer to Dr. Kiekhaefer or Jean-Patrice Boudet or to Frank Claassen. I mean, my area of expertise is quite limited when it comes to textual analysis or historical research, that I could maintain such a relationship of help. However, I've always found a very good understanding from their part and very keen intentions of help and of mutual agreements when it comes to my needs. So whenever I wrote to Frank Claassen or to Dr. Kiekhaefer or to Ms. Fanger, I've had to wait, of course, because I know they're very busy people, and I've always found a response in regards to what I was looking for. One example, of course, is my research for this book of Bileth, and I was actually talking to Dan Harms about the article that I couldn't find anywhere by Jean-Patrice Boudet on Liber Bileth, and he actually told me he ordered it and had every intention of sharing it with me. As well, Dan Schneider, who is a very profound researcher in magical manuscripts and very discerning individual, offered to obtain it by a library loan and scan it and send it to me, but it appears that Dan Harms beat him to it. So it has been a great help to have another look at this sort of material and to see how much similar it is to the text I translated and published, to see that it's completely different. It's from another textual tradition. It has another means of expression, and it's completely different. Two books from apparently the same source and the same space with apparently the same title are extremely different. When it comes to collaboration, I'm always open to collaboration, and I find that as open as I am to help others, others are prone to help me in my studies. I always tend to help without asking for stuff in return. And of course, people just give me stuff when I need them, because a lot of people offer me manuscripts, and a lot of people offer me books or access to journals and articles, but that's very much conditioned by what I ask. I mean, nobody says, oh, here's a link to this very rare article from 2008 about the Demon King Bileth. No, I have to go around, research, and ask the right people. And of course, they're very much inclined to help. They're wonderful, wonderful people.
How do you research manuscripts, Mihai? Can you kind of share with the listeners who aren't too familiar about exactly how you approach the kind of kinetics, so to speak, of manuscript research? Like, how is it done?
To tell the truth, the fact that we have more and more digital copies of manuscripts have totally changed the subject of researching them. So the high quality scans of certain manuscripts actually eliminated the possibility of going to a certain library and studying them. If we take, for example, the Florentine Manual of Magic from the Laurentian Library in Florence, if I were to raise money and go to Florence and spend some few days, maybe 2 or 3 days in Florence, and pay for accommodation and food and transportation and access to the library, I would get access to this manuscript. I wouldn't gain that much more than researching the manuscript from the comfort of my own home, because the high quality scan of the manuscript allows me to isolate a certain word or sentence or graphic, and I can use it on a screen and blow it up so I can research it more effectively. Whereas if I would have to read the manuscript itself, the writing would be very small and problematic, and my eyes probably would shift from line to line. So it would be a great effort and a great financial effort and a great waste of time to do something that is less than effective than researching it on my screen. So I largely hunt for digitized manuscripts or take advantage of already digitized manuscripts and just research them. There's a tricky part in this because not every library allows the material to be published. Right now I'm working on a few images from a Bodleian manuscript, and I don't have the rights to reproduce them on my blog. Dan Harms published the manuscript in translation and actually had to do the images to redo the graphics with a very talented artist. And I'm in the process of obtaining the rights to reproduce a few of the designs on my blog. And I had to petition the Bodleian library, tell them that this is not for a book, I will not make no money from this, and this is non-commercial, it's just for the sake of knowledge, and I still have to pay money to use the designs and their custodianship just to reproduce them in order for people to see them and to study them freely. So that's one aspect of it. But luckily, there are more manuscripts that are widely available and nobody wants any money from it, like the Leipzig manuscript and the Darmstadt manuscript and the Ghent manuscript. They're all free to use and reproduce, and this is just a blessing.
Mihai, you have so many different articles and new manuscripts and different things that you tackle, and one of your interests, among many others, is one of mine, which is the Heptameron. And I find this text so fascinating, so beautiful, so elegant. It seems to have, 5 or 6 different tributaries in terms of where it comes from historically, but it is certainly its own thing. Of course, it's the parent, quote unquote, of the English Lemegeton Goetia conjurations. Can you share with our listeners, Mihai, just a little bit about what is the Heptameron and why is the text so significant?
I believe that the text became hugely popular because of the English translation by Robert Turner in 1655. I think it grew in popularity then, but it was always popular because it has been published, so it didn't circulate only in manuscript form. I think it was attributed to Peter Diabano, but we have no idea if he truly wrote it. I mean, the abbot Tritemius tells us that he wrote a magical book on conjurations, which he cites as the Elucidarium Magicum or the Elucidarium Negromanticum. It might well be the same work, but we have no idea if what Tritemius knows as the Elucidarium actually is a work by Peter Diabano, because he has been ascribed with numerous works on magic and astrology and geomancy and works on rings, magical rings and necromancy that he clearly did not write because I don't think he was interested in magic at all, the historical Peter Diabano. But yes, it has a lot of tributaries. You're very correct in naming it a parent of many grimoires and ritual lineages. It's not the grandparent or the ancestor, but it's just a parent because it has a lot of offspring. The grimoire of Turiel and the material used by Hockley to divine and, of course, the Lemegeton are its children, but its parents, if we were to take a look historically, would be indeed this missing text, the Elucidarium Negromanticum, of which we do have a manuscript, as far as I know, in the Vatican Library. It has already been scanned, and it contains the seals of the archangels, just as we know them. I think it's from the 13th or the 14th century, I'm not sure, so it's the oldest version we have of the Heptameron proper, but it's also on paper, written, I believe, with a ferrogallic ink, which corrodes the paper, and it's extremely thin. So it's like looking at a text written very, very poorly in Latin, in cursive Latin, and both sides of the paper actually overlap hugely. And we have to do a lot of graphical work to separate one side of the paper from the other side, and then, and only then, to try and transcribe the Latin text, and then after we transcribe it, we can translate it. So it's a very difficult process to see what the Lucidarium Negromanticum contains. But I believe it's largely the text contained in the Heptameron. And one other book that it has for a source, I think it's the Sefer Raziel, the Latin version of the Sefer Raziel, which in turn is an offspring of the older Sefer Harazim, about the angels of the altitudes and so forth. Also the Sworn Book of Honorius is something that it's very closely related to, because it names the aerial kings to be called forth from the sublunar planetary regions of the earth. Those Jinn kings we were talking about are indeed common with the Sworn Book of Honorius. The angels of the altitudes and the armies of the heavens are common with the Sefer Harazim, which is very old. It's a whole mixture of diverse materials coming together in one succinct, practical handbook. And I believe it has been used quite a lot. If we were to just look at its offsprings, when it comes to grimoire magic, taking apart the published materials, we can see in the Leipzig collection of manuscripts quite a lot of manuscripts and a lot of grimoires using the Heptameron as a source, but grimoires that have been worked and discovered or laid down after practice. We have new grimoires that take the Heptameron and use the dates and the kings and the angels in new pentacles, in new methods, and we have new seals of the spirits employed. One such manuscript that I've actually had a chance to delve in lists seven seals of 7 spirits that are connected to the aerial kings, the first of the ministers of the aerial kings. So someone has had access to the Heptameron proper and actually worked the system and did not contact, let's say, just the aerial kings, but contacted the ministers of the aerial kings used in the conjurations, as far as we can figure out, had contact with them and seemingly made a covenant with them and obtained such seals, because this is the classical way of getting seals from the other side, striking a deal with the spirit and getting its seal, just like you would somebody, I don't know, a law firm or somebody else. You just make a deal and they stamp your little book. That's why it's fascinating. I mean, it's somewhere in the midway of a whole magical tradition, because it has a lot of children and it has a lot of ancestors and a lot of parents. It's quite well documented, actually.
The Clavis Inferni also is basically the entire Heptameron, but it's written in backwards Latin, and then they add in the 4 kings of the 4 directions.
The grimoire proper from the Clavis Inferni is actually a bit different, because it's centered on the Faustian school of magic, which is actually interesting. The Faustian school of magic draws quite a lot from the Heptameron and its children, because we can find a lot in the Faustian books of magic from the Lamaghettan, and we have some spirits in common with the Goetia and the Theurgia Goetia, but also with the Heptameron, which inspired the Theurgia Goetia and the Goetia process. So we can call the whole Faustian school of magic a very pale reflection of the Heptameron operation. It took some things from the Heptameron and from the 4th book of occult philosophy, which were popular in the German-speaking countries and were translated, but also they added and discovered new things and practiced and added and so forth into something entirely new. So the Faustian school of ritual magic is something very, very very precise and very unique. It uses a lot of codes. It uses a lot of steganographic shortenings or scribal notes or sigle, and they're used something that they're used to shorten the contents of the text to be written in the small booklet. And some believe that they are encoded to be a part of the conjuration and of the oath that the spirit has to take on the little booklet. So some believe it has a magical quality to it, and some believe it just has an encoding quality to it. It's very, very interesting, in fact.
As you mentioned, the Heptameron, it's such an important text. One of the things that does not make an appearance in the Heptameron, two things really, that of course now there's a ton of discussion on. One is the kind of a location for the spirit specifically to manifest, like a triangle or something like that. It just says, uticanti cerculum, basically just says like appear in front of the circle before the circle. But the other thing that doesn't appear are the four kings of the four directions. There's no actual appearance of you must go for this king first or that, but you have these aerial kings. Can you just comment on those two things from your expertise in terms of why those two don't make at least a direct appearance?
The reasons are debatable because, as I said, there's no one true system that permeates all of history when it comes to angelology or demonology. So the four kings of the four emperors of the directions are not always present in everything. We do know that in Arabic magic there are four higher, immensely powerful and influential jinn emperors that reside over every jinn and have a direct correlation with the four archangels of the directions. These are in turn translated as the four emperors of hell. But there is no continuity between a lot of texts when it comes to this. Let's say if we take the Goetia, we have a lack of the four kings, only mentions of the four kings, because it was written from a garbled up variant of the Liber Spiritum that Johannes Weyer took and extracted from it the higher part of the hierarchy of hell. In turn, it got garbled up and mangled and transmitted as it was, without the three higher up demons and the four emperors and so forth. So there are also systems that lack the four emperors entirely, like versions of the Liber Spiritum that begin only with Beelzebul, and then it just goes on with a few other minor demons. So the four emperors of hell do not make an appearance in every grimoire. They do make an appearance in a lot of grimoires, but not in every grimoire. One other reason why the four emperors might not appear in the Heptameron is the view that the aerial kings are not in fact infernal. As I've stated before, I believe the Heptameron is not an angelic book of magic. It's meant to summon the spirits that are called the aerial kings, which are sublunar in nature and do come from different parts of the world, just like the spirits of the Vârtejaru, but they're not infernal in a proper sense of the word, so they would not be subject to the four emperors. That's just one way of conceptualizing such a difference. So if we would have a clear-cut definition of the four aerial kings as being demonic in nature or adversarial, then yes, maybe we might be expected that the seven kings might be subjected to the four emperors. But since we don't have that, we just have to assume that the four emperors have nothing to do with the seven kings, and the seven kings are subjected in their authority only to the seven planetary archangels.
There tends to be this trend, especially in modern discussions, to fit things together, like things have to fit together like a puzzle piece, and they don't really have to, because, as you mentioned, these are different historical tributaries, different strains. I assume it'd be the same thing for the location of the spirit to manifest. Like in the Heptameron, of course, it says, constrigno vos uticanti cerculum, but there is no in hoc triangulo. There is no I constrict you inside the triangle. It's just uticanti cerculum, just before this circle. And I assume, would it be the same thing as the kings, that hey, I mean, some grimoires have this kind of location and others maybe it's a little bit more general?
It's a funny thing because if we look at the Book of Lights in the Sefer Maftech Shlomo, which is a variant of the Heptameron, we actually do have the circle of the Heptameron with a triangle clearly delineated before the circle, so a place where the spirit can be constrained. But since we have no translation yet of the Book of Lights in the Sefer Maftech Shlomo, we cannot know if it's a general triangle or it's something to hold the spirits only if they lie, because this is a very important thing actually. Many people think that the triangle described in the Goetia is a general thing that you have to have and it's part of the ritual and so forth and so on. But actually, if you read the text carefully, the triangle is just employed if a spirit is lying and if he is seen as mischievous. So the triangle is not something that is meant to be traced or put out for every spirit. Only in a few cases, a few exceptionally rare cases, maybe 3 or 4 spirits in the Goetia have the triangle listed as one of the means of coercion or subjugation and to make them not lie and tell the truth. So we have no idea if the triangle mentioned in the Sefer Urim, in the Book of Lights, actually has the utility of making them manifest or of making them telling the truth. So it's quite an interesting fact. So here we can see the original method of the Heptameron before the collation of the Lamageddon without a triangle. So the spirit is just called forth before the circle, yes, without having a precise place in which it should be manifested and restricted to.
One of the things, if we could examine on the Heptameron really quick, that I find fascinating is about 3/4 of the way through the ritual, there's just all of these references that are made, and I'm wondering if you can maybe share with the listeners about maybe where some of these references come from. But in English, it's basically where you present the pentacle before the spirits, and then you say, Berelanensis, Baldachiensis, Paumachiae, et apologe sedis, by the most mighty kings and powers and the most powerful princes, genii, Liacidae, ministers of the Tartarian seat, chief prince of the seat of Apologia in the 9th legion. I invoke you, and by invoking I conjure you. I mean, I remember first reading that going, whoa, there's so many references here to places and the Tartarian seat and the 9th Legion. Is there anything that you can share with the listeners, Mihai, about kind of where this comes from or what specifically is being invoked here?
Yes, of course, I've decoded them all and I could tell them to you, but you'd have to become a patron on Patreon, so you have to... No, indeed, there are some missing cosmological pieces from the Heptameron, just as there are missing cosmological pieces in every text. But I've found that these bits and pieces of conjurational dialogue do occur in many other texts. So we have similar versions in the Book of Honorius. We have similar versions in the Cambridge Book of Magic that Francis Young deciphered and published. We have similar wordings and constructions in the Book of Oberon that Dan Harms and Joseph Peterson put out. If we do not have all possible extant texts and manuscripts that do contain similar constructions in order to formulate some kind of table to compare them, we have no idea if they are correct renditions of what they should be, if they are part of some older cosmology that it's unknown to us, or if the first part, the transmission of the correct names, is in fact hiding the fact that they're part of some cosmology that we know, but we cannot identify because of the mistakes. So if we don't have a lot of texts to go about and search, we have no idea what they refer to, because they might be very obscure figures in some cosmology. Because if you take the oldest texts of the Geniza Magical Collection, and if you take the PGMs, the Greek Magical Papyri, you will have divine names that are and explained in part in some special books that are only employed in some conjurations and spells. If we look at the Liber Juratus, we have a lot of sacred names that are treated separately, whose virtue is clearly explained, but they're not explained in the practical parts. So we have 90 or 100 divine names that are explained duly in their special own book, but when it comes to being employed in practice or in a conjuration, the author does not begin to delve into the name, and you should say the word anefexeton, which is the word that was used by Moses when... No, they just use the word and they assume that the practitioner has the necessary wealth of information to know what it means. So this might be such a case. Second, they can be part of a special demonology or a special type of hierarchy that we have missing, since we don't have the original texts of the Liber Spiritum that were very influential or were in fact the root of the text. We have no idea if these names were higher demons or special words of power used to compel the demons that are under the planetary rulership. So we have no idea, but we can study the text and see if there are similarities between the texts, and there are quite a few.
I know on Esoteric Archives, Joseph Peterson shares a personal communication he had with Marathakis, talking about, he's saying, quote, in Petrus's version, all the words Berlanensis, Baldachiensis, Paumachiae, Etapologiae are, in my opinion, meaning in his opinion, attributes of the word sedis, or seat. And then he says that Apologiae is obvious from Honorius, Paumachiae is a corruption of Primariae, and then Baldachiensis, he says, probably means a throne with a baldacchino, meaning a canopy or something. But like you said, there seems to be this blending of different words, different times in history, and when a magician is using these words, they are simply using the words as a barbarous name of power to constrain or to engage with the spirit. When someone uses, anafexeton, for example, you're not really clarifying to the spirit all of the different things that are needed there. Like you just have the power of the word itself.
Well, these are two separate things to keep in mind, because if we take a look from the practical side of things and from the praxis of ritual evocation, which is not my aim in my articles or on my blog, and I do not treat the practical side of things at all, just the academical and textual side of things. If we take into account the practical side of things, the root of the word and the etymology and the source is completely irrelevant, because all these conjurations and all these invocations are meant to be effective only when used in the ritual itself, when written in the Liber Spiritum or the Liber Consecrationum, which Richard Kiekhaefer actually published in two versions, very similar versions in his Necromancer's Manual from the 15th century, CLM 849 manuscript, which indeed is very interesting. And there are versions, there are portions of the Book of Consecrations where it actually says in the prayer that every word that is mangled and every word that is written wrong, let it be made powerful by the virtue of the other conjurations, which would be correct, and by the virtue of the fasting of the magician and of the ritual itself and the purity of the magician and the intent. It doesn't matter for the ritualistic, for the magician, if the word itself is saklai or sadai, which would be a closer rendition of the Hebrew name El Shaddai. So it wouldn't matter, because it would contain a spelling error that would be corrected by the virtue of the book it's written in. So for the ritualist, it's entirely without any importance, the etymology and the meaning. So the word saklai and the word sadai would actually have the same power once they would be infused with the ritual they have to be consecrated by. If we are looking at things from a scientific point of view, which is my standpoint on my blog and on my articles, I'm very keen to identify sources and find missing traces and find similarities and find etymologies. It's a passion of mine. It's sort of a pastime, but it's also a very innate curiosity I have towards such texts because, for one, you could find out how a seal got corrupted or evolved graphically from one treatise to another. And second, you can see how a word becomes another word from one manuscript to another, and why you cannot base your etymologies on the word that we have today. So Baldachiensis might be something completely different in another manuscript. We cannot equate it to a baldacchino just because it has the bald part in it. We might equate it with something related to baldness. I don't know. It's very far-fetched. I often see some authors treating lists of spirits in such a manner because they have a list of spirits and they try to fit the spirits in what they know. So this spirit looks like Mihai, and this spirit looks like Agares, and this spirit looks like something from the Heptameron in the day of Saturday, and this spirit looks like something from the 7 books of Moses. This is wrong because, for one, some texts might not be so closely related that they share the same cosmology and the same angelology. The simpler a name is, the more likely it is to meet it in more texts. The more complex a word or a divine name or an angelic name is, the lesser the possibility we could meet it in different kinds of texts. So if we take Michael or Gabriel or Uriel, we can find dozens and dozens of appearances of spirits that have similar names. And if we have Baldachiensis, which is a longer word, the chances that we meet something similar and yet unrelated are very, very slim. And we can indeed say that there's a correlation. But if we do not have a precise textual correlation and just a similarity between some words, we actually cannot base our explanation or translation or etymology on something that superficial. So that's my standpoint.
In addition to your studies on Magic Blog, Mihai, is there anything else that you want to share with the listeners about where they can find you, or any other information, or if you want to touch on anything that we have not discussed so far yet?
Yes, of course. I can be stalked at the subway in Bucharest if we are in the same city, so you can stalk me. But no, on a serious note, there's a great temptation for people to add me on Facebook, and this is something I touched upon on a recent blog post. I love talking to people, so I love explaining things to people. I love communicating, but whenever I post something, whenever I share something on my blog and on the Facebook page related to the blog, I have a whole host of people just adding me on Facebook. I used to be very friendly and I used to add back everybody, and people just stood around my friend list and didn't say anything for a year and 2 years, and I started cutting down on my friendships, at least on Facebook. So if you do have something to ask, if you do have something to tell me, if you want to share something, if you want to learn something, if you have a personal thing you would like to discuss with me, just send me a message. You don't have to send me a friendship. You don't have to send me an ad. You can just follow the page. You can just follow the Studies on Magic Facebook page and the blog, and you will get every post I write about magic, and there will be nothing that you miss. Adding me on Facebook is highly irrelevant because that's not what I use Facebook for. I never share anything related to magic or esotericism or seals or something like this on my personal Facebook because people in my list are not interested in that. That's why I made a specific page for the blog. So if you have anything to ask, if you have anything to request from me, you can just write in comments, because I know it sounds weird, but the blog has a comment section. Or you could just write to me on Facebook and promise I will reply. So I'm a busy guy, but I will reply to each and every message to the best of my abilities. There are a few question and answers on a few pages on my blog. There are a few great big letter signs on my blog. So I actually make a point of not teaching magic and telling people I do not teach magic. I will not teach you how to practice magic. I will not obtain your dream girl or job or something like this. The blog is about the academic study of magical texts throughout history and of the subsequent diagrams and seals in these manuscripts. It's not a blog of magic, it's about magic. So it's a very, very important delineation I'm trying to make. So whenever somebody requires me to do some kind of magical service to them, I kindly explain to everybody that I don't do that. So even if you have something like this to tell me, I will refuse your request, but I will do it in a gentle and kind fashion. So I will not ignore any messages I receive.
Mihai, Vârtejaru, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time and sharing your expertise and your wisdom on the Glitch Bottle podcast.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, of course you cannot thank me enough. Okay. Thank you as well for having me. You are a great host and you have a great radio voice and you're a great guy and it's been a pleasure.
Oh, listeners, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Mihai as much as I did. Mihai's a reminder that multiple tributaries of esoteric wisdom doesn't mean one is right and the other is wrong, but that they're different was absolutely rejuvenating and incredibly practical, and I hope in some small way it reminds you to definitely make sure to compare texts, of course, but if you're looking to practice consistently, making sure not to weigh your consciousness down with comparative history only, which could prevent you from stepping into the circle directly. So thanks as always goes to you, the listeners, for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast, and a huge thanks to my Glitch Bottle Patreon supporters. I was so nervous launching the Glitch Bottle page on Patreon, but I am so glad that I did, and I am truly enjoying getting to know my awesome patrons and private messages and sharing exclusive in-depth member content, videos, posts, and more. And if you'd like to consider supporting Glitch Bottle, just check out patreon.com/glitchbottle, and you can always subscribe on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Until next time, this is Alexander F. reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.